Over the next 5 to 10 years, what happens?
You are the goat of the gateways.
We're going to embrace the golden thread more. There's a lot that's coming. The Safety Act's just one part.
I think sometimes some planning departments deliberately don't validate things when they've got a huge backlog.
Do you think that's definitely going to happen?
Oh, it will happen. I'm Varun Soni. I'm director of the Property Smart Group, and I spend most of my days advising people how to get through Building Safety Act gateways 2 and 3 and how to deal with occupied buildings, going through building regs and repairs.
Varun, welcome to the podcast. Could you tell me, what is the one thing that people need to know about you to understand why you're the goat of the gateways?
Hi Ollie, hi John, thanks for having us on. Well, in terms of the goat of the gateways, I've been involved with the development of the Building Safety Act from its inception after the tragedy of Grenfell, being one of the advisors for MHCLG, DeLuc, and then back to MHCLG, as well as part of the Building Regulation Advisory Committee, which got disbanded a few years back and then became the Building Advisory Committee, which I'm still involved with. So I've had quite a lot of involvement when it came into the primary legislation, secondary legislation, the guidance that's come off there. And I've undertaken 17 applications at Gateway 2, 2 at Gateway 3 so far. None have failed, and I would like to continue that record.
Nice. And just before we go too much further, for those who don't understand all of those acronyms, could you give like a bit of a zoomed out view of like what is the Building Safety Act? I don't think you need to do why, because everyone knows as a result of Grenfell, but like how the framework works at a sort of high level.
So when you think of the Building Safety Act is actually the largest construction law in history. It's bigger than the Building Act of 1984. The whole premise behind the Building Safety Act is that we actually have a cultural change within the construction industry. It's about being able to provide more clarity, better quality design, better quality build, and more information for those that are looking after and managing buildings, including residents, to make sure they're safer. It does apply to every single project. The difference is certain projects will fall under what we call a HRB, known as a higher risk building. So please don't confuse that with high-rise buildings. And that definition can change at any time. So the whole point behind that is a HRB currently will fall 7 stories, 18 metres, whichever comes first, 2 or more residential units. It only picks up on resi units within hospitals and care facilities as well, not just hospitals and care facilities. And they will fall through a different building control route than a traditional project would fall. That doesn't mean that the Building Safety Act does not apply to traditional projects that fall under that scope. They still do. They still need to have specific roles and responsibilities that are associated to certain project team members, but they would continue to go through a traditional building control route, whereas with the HRB, they'll go through something called the gateways. The gateways are not too onerous if you know how to tackle them. And I say that because if we look at Gateway 1 as a prime example, adding a fire statement in, where you're working on projects in places like London and you have a GLA requirement, you're already creating a fire statement, which we've been doing for 10 years. Yeah. So that's no different. And that actually falls outside of the remit of your other gateways because it falls under the Town and Country Planning Act.
So that's amazing, and thank you. That's a really helpful introduction. I think in terms of just take it back a step, because there's so much in this, and there's so many different parts. I think from just trying to understand, how did you get there, and what were you thinking, and what were the co-authors thinking when you were actually writing this?
So I was brought in for my digital expertise. So one of the things that I have in the background is I'm one of those that has been one of the technical authors around writing information management requirements within this country. Also been a part of the development of competency requirements within this country, so the British standards. And that kind of just was my first in. When I got to the table, I only thought I was bringing my expertise from the digital side, not from my architectural background and my everyday industry background. What really came apparent very clearly is we had a very mixed team, and we still do, of industry experts that are working day to day, and then strategic experts that might have the qualifications but haven't really worked on projects, so they don't understand how the industry works as such. They're very intelligent people.
What was the ratio of people that knew how the industry worked
About
to
60-40.
in favour of people that didn't know how the industry worked?
Yeah.
Like that feels like that. It feels like it might have been even further.
But I think, they all have the right intention.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes, with it being a new standard, there's always going to be things that we know need to change, and they will change. We've made it clear, if you read part 1, even the definition of a HRB is going to change. I've designed buildings, I've worked on projects, but you don't see the end outcome. People who are innocent that don't deserve to ever have that tragedy, think of those families. So that's always been in the back of my mind every single day since I've done that. And I think that was in the back of the mind of every single person that was involved and is still involved, if I'm honest with you. It doesn't mean that we get everything right, but at least people understand why we're doing it.
It's very powerful, and I think it is important to remember that. I think at everything that we do, I think what would be really useful to understand is, in that case, what are the key components then to make sure that we meet those requirements. What are the top 5 kind of points that you think that people need to remember when they're trying to make their buildings work for the Building Safety Act?
The first thing is having a complete cultural change. In all honesty, when we think about the projects we've worked on, and we've all been in the industry long enough to know that when we talk about D&B, it's not design and build, it's build and design. Now we have to change the way in which we approach things. It's a case of actually thinking about what we're putting together before we start building it. It's also about making people realise that they are accountable for the work that they do. It's a team effort. I think people always forget, and certainly when we come into this industry, when we see a lot of people talking, they always speak about, we can't do this because we want to absolve our risk. We can't do that. We want to absolve our risk, as if it's a blame game. And we've got to realise we're a team. It doesn't matter if you're not pulling your weight, you're letting the whole team down. The buck doesn't just stop with one person, it stops with everybody. And that, for me, is the cultural shift. So that's probably the first part. The next part I would say is we've got to have the right people on projects. Competency is not something that we just talk about in the Act, it's something that we preach. And the reason being is those that are competent, they have that know-how, that they don't want to cut corners, they don't want to do something incorrectly, they have that pride. And that's where that behavioural and that ethical approach comes from when it comes to a competency. So competent people, and part of that means upskilling our industry as well, because we've got an ageing industry of technical knowledge. We need to be able to bring our younger teams through so that they gain that same technical knowledge. So that would be another part.
I think, can I just, on that point about competency, I think the primary and secondary legislation is pretty clear about what it expects in terms of competencies, but it's not very clear in terms of what it expects about deliverables. And I think it's maybe because that's an easier bit, and or maybe it's not. Maybe a cultural shift in the industry is harder, but there's lots of stuff that states what you expect in terms of your competencies, and very little about what you actually need to put in your application.
So this is where you're referring to what documents need to go into an application.
Yeah, I've jumped ahead a bit. Sorry. I found it odd that it was such an imbalance between, like, the competency thing is really clear, and then after that it's like, and now you should know what needs to happen because you're competent. And it's like, well, that's...
The issue you have is every project is different, therefore you're going to have different information within every project. Every project is unique. Now, yes, there should be more guidance, and I would agree with you on what are the core deliverables. But if you actually look at the secondary legislation, they don't go into detail on how you deliver things, but they do actually tell you really a lot of the documents do it, like things like construction control plans, narrative around how you're complying with building regulations, things around mandatory occurrence reporting. Now, they don't go into detail, I agree, but they do actually, if you read it carefully, they do actually start to list out the documents that are required. They don't go into detail saying, look, as an architect, you need to design a building like this, you need to have this many GA plans, this many fire plans, this. They don't go into that detail. But the way they look at it, every scheme is different, and if you're competent, you would know how much information you need to be able to hit a REBA stage 4 application. Now, yes, it would be nice to have detail, but that's kind of where people like myself come in play, because we've worked on enough projects to say, look, these are the functional requirements you need to meet. These are the typical bits of information we would expect you to have in order to meet that.
Yeah, and for me, that's the key. I mean, I've got so many developer clients saying, "Oh, what exactly do we need to provide? Will that get us through Gateway? How many applications have you got through Gateway?" And
17.
17. That's amazing.
So far. Touch wood, that continues.
I didn't think there was that many that have gone through in total.
No, that's Gateway 2.
That's Gateway 2.
So Varun, you've got 17 through Gateway 2, and you're working on 2 Gateway 3s now, or you've got
two have been submitted. We're still waiting for the feedback.
And have you got the stats overall on the amount of submissions to Gateway 2 and a percentage of them that have gone through, and then same with Gateway 3?
So where it goes into Gateway 2, 1,680 have gone into Gateway 2, only 166 have passed. 400 are still waiting to be approved. The rest have been withdrawn or rejected. Where it comes to Gateway 3, the latest stats that we had, only 10% have actually passed. There's less than 100 applications that have gone in, but only 10% have passed so far.
10% have passed. So it's pretty low pass rate, which is, I mean, one of the reasons why we probably hear so much of it from clients or in the industry is that's painful, and that's sort of preventing development.
But where just on that, John, where you think of Gateway 3, you can't occupy a building.
And so how many Gateway 3s have gone through?
Only 10% have passed the Gateway.
But it seems that 10% have gone through
No,
on Gateway 2. You said 1,600 applications and
only
160 passed. That's 10%.
Passed. Yeah, so
it's 10% of Gateway 2 and then 10% of Gateway 3. So, I mean, we can see just those stats alone tell you that there's a problem with trying to get this moving efficiently and effectively with its ambition to enhance the industry and to make buildings safer, right?
Completely. I mean, it's not just passing, it's also the time restraints that it's causing. The average time at the moment for a new build going through HRB Gateway 2 is around 16 weeks. An existing building is 18 and a half weeks. So you're waiting to even undertake something like a door replacement.
I think most clients would accept, particularly on a new build, most clients would accept those time scales. But the horror stories we're hearing is 45 weeks.
I was going to say
weeks.
I've never had an application 16 weeks.
No, that seems all right.
What's your average? I mean, if you've done 17,
about 21 weeks.
21 weeks, and they're mainly new build or mix?
Mix. So where it's come to new builds, altogether we've done 11 new builds, 6 existing.
And what sort of scale are we talking here? Are they? I mean, I guess once you go over 80 metres, it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, I mean, our smallest one has been something that has been 7 stories, fairly simple, only 4 different unit types all the way up. Fantastic, simple site. Didn't have to worry about UKBN, heat networks, nothing else having to come in. So it was quite an easy set. That was 21 weeks. Where we've got complicated, and we've definitely got complicated, where we've had a number of HRBs that have been on with the podium over a number of phases that have tried to go in as a phased application. We've also got to 39 weeks. And on that application, it took 12 weeks to just validate the application, just to tell us that we've got all the documents there.
Have you had any Gateway 2s refused on Diola? Nice.
That's why I'm the go.
So what's the magic sauce then that you offer and that people need? Because if only 10% of applications are getting through, but 100% of yours are getting through, what's the key? It's
about making sure that you're very clear in how you're actually meeting functional requirements. Narrative is key. I think one of the biggest things that people don't realise, the building safety regulator and their multidisciplinary teams, they're looking at multiple applications, making sure that things are structured in a way that's easy for them to read, easy for them to find the information. So it's not, hidden within millions of different drawings, evidencing that information and being very clear in how you do it. It's critical. They will come back with questions, and that's absolutely fine. They're allowed to come back with questions. But if you minimise how many questions by giving them good narratives and good evidence to back up your narrative, it makes it just that little bit easier.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the new principal designer role.
Okay.
There's quite a lot of... so you're a principal design advisor. You're not actually doing the principal designer role because you're not designing the project. So that makes sense. I mean, it's interesting for us as architects. We think that if we lean into the legislation, it is a positive thing for the industry, for architects, because it actually sort of takes back control in terms of the process and the specification, and also like just the project management. Really, you end up being, as a principal designer, a project manager of the design phases. But one of the kind of the myths, I suppose, is that the extent of the role, which is a design role, how much does it extend onto site in terms of inspections?
Well, you see, this is where it becomes a difficult one. The whole point behind the requirements of a building regs PD is that it is the person that is leading, or the organisation that is leading the design in that given time. Now, where it comes to being on site, effectively your contracting team, your principal contractor and their design manager, if it's a D&B and they are on site, then really they're taking it on. If it's traditional and you're still keeping the design works, then contract obviously would mean that potentially you could. The difficulty you have is, unless you're on site all day, every day, how can you actually say that what has been built not only complies with the designs that went through Gateway 2, but also have gone through the functional requirements and meet building regs? You need to have that evidence. Now, where you're not potentially going through the gateways and you're a building reg PD, if you're going through a traditional contract, you could still hold part of the design, but we would still expect that the contractor would end up taking it on. You would almost go up to a stage 4A. From there, you would say, look, we've done our part as building regs PD, we've coordinated the design, this is exactly what we've meant to do, and then thereafter the person taking on that lead design role, which would be your contractor, effectively they would take.
Can I clarify though on that? So in the way you're seeing it work, or the way you imagine it working, so for most large projects in the UK now, they're a D&B of sorts. There are some traditional, but mostly I'd say it's moved to D&B. You'd have potentially the main design team going up to 4A as and the architect probably being the principal designer typically. And then when it was D&B'd over, then would it be the design manager or the contracts manager who would become the PD? Design manager, because often an architect by training, not always, but often, or an engineer, who then would take it over. Now, the architect's often still retained, sometimes as a PD advisor, in my experience. How would you see them functioning? Would they be visiting site once a month, once a week? Because this is what I get a little bit, this is a selfish interest here, about, like you say, I can't make sure that they've put every bolt in the on the steel or everything else, but I can do a general inspection.
But is the principal designer's role anyway to ensure that the bolt is installed? Because my understanding of it, perhaps wrongly, is that the principal designer has to coordinate the design, and then the principal contractor has to make sure the bolt goes in.
But at Gateway, so where we're talking a HRB.
That's non-HRB.
So non-HRB. All right, so non-HRB, exactly that. You're coordinating a design and making sure that what's being built on site meets the requirements of your design. So on that, I would still want to go once a week. I would still want that assurance that what's being built, yourself, construction projects can go up quite quickly. So you want to make sure that what's behind that wall's been done in the way that you've actually designed and coordinated it.
And you broadly want to, because there's a spirit of, they have about the kind of ethics of your kind of the way you're going to do things. So if you design something you knew they'd basically taken out all the rock wool and put Celotex in to save money, so
you're saying if the architect retains the role of the PD, they should be going to site once a week?
But
mostly it's going to...
If it's a non-HRB.
If it's a non-HRB.
If it's a HRB, you don't leave that site. And that's because I don't see a way.
Which is why it becomes a contractor's responsibility, because it's unrealistic.
It's impossible, unless you go to the traditional site architect who's actually based on there, walking the site every day doing...
I don't even think from I mean, I know this podcast is about me getting asked questions, but a question back to yourselves. From an insurance perspective, would your insurance company allow you to take on a building regs PD role if you weren't on site all day, every day during the build?
I'm just in the process of renewal, and they're asking questions, but it's not as many as you
really.
Well, what I've had feedback, and we're having a discussion with some insurers as well coming up, was what they were saying is, well, you were already basically liable for a lot of this risk anyway as an architect. Now you should be doing it better and more organised, and we've put forward how we're doing it. Depending on the different project and services, different clients are kind of pushing us in slightly different directions. And I think what we're trying to establish, every member of our senior team is doing the RIBA training, and then we're going to cascade that down. But what is trying to get a sense of what we feel.
But
is right.
I think that you won't end up in a scenario. The industry will settle upon a solution that works. And is that realistically that you have an architect on site day in, day out? No. I think the contractor will end up being
the design manager.
The design manager of the contractor will be.
So we'll do it up to 4A typically as an architect,
or maybe
and
4B,
then
if you need to get the gateway 2 submission,
and then you'll have a more regular inspection. And also, I think the point here, and this is where I think we get into your point before, it's the sort of designer that is leading this process. So if you suddenly go, hold on a second, guys, you've changed all the fire protection to the steels from one thing to another. This is not good, right? You need to work this through. You need to go back to the regulator. Then you have quite a lot of power actually to kind of really put your foot down.
And where it comes to that, for me, you would need to be on site, because you would need to be picking this up as part of your change control so that you could go back to the client. It needs to go back to the PC. If there's mandatory occurrence reports, any incidents, you need to be aware of it. You've only got 10 days to let the regulator know what's going on site. So if there's, and it's, I'm not saying that principal contractors are untrustworthy, because they're not, but if they don't tell you, or if the wrong communication channels are not there, then potentially you may not know about some structural deficiency. That's
and this is all HRB we're talking about.
If the principal contractor is the principal designer, are they not then policing, self-policing?
Potentially it's a conflict of interest. Yeah. However, they are in charge of the design, and under Regulation 11A, that is the whole point. It's the person who's leading on the design. It would go back to, even if you think about, a lift replacement, it wouldn't be an architect that's a PD. It would be your lift engineer, because they're the ones that are undertaking the work. Because they're the design team that are involved, and they're the ones that are in charge of it.
Can I ask you a question about this? So quite often, especially historically, the kind of direction of a project will be led possibly by the client, a PM, a QS, a contractor, who will be saying, no, you just got to do it like this, make it work. Do you think they're taking on the responsibility as a designer there, if they're sort of predicating a solution? And could you answer that?
Well, yeah, they are, because they're giving you the design input of exactly how something needs to work together. Now, where it comes to that, they then have to have their competency checks. They should have that anyway as a principal contractor, but from a design element, are they actually the competent person that you should be taking their approach from? Now, yes, they might know how to meet the functional requirements of building regs. Yes, they might have the knowledge, skill and experience to do so, but does it actually coordinate with the rest of your design? Because these are things that the regulator has every right to ask. Even if you've gone through Gateway 2 and you're on site, what you've also got to think about, if we talk HRBs, where they're saying you've got to do something in a certain way, well, as a PD, you need to liaise with the principal contractor. If they take on that role as a PD, they need to think about, well, what does that change fall under? Is it a major? Is it a notifiable? Is it a recordable? What major change means they have to stop work for 6 weeks. So who's best placed to do that? The design manager, potentially, because they're the ones that understand exactly what they're ordering, what's changed, and they're the ones that have potentially been doing the value engineering a bit later than they should have.
Yeah.
Potentially.
So I've got some questions about HRBs. So focus in now on HRBs.
Okay.
You are the GOAT of the gateways. What specific documents and evidence are like the essential for a successful Gateway 2, and also what are the most common clangers that you see? Okay,
so in order to have a successful application at Gateway 2, make sure you've got design narrative about your design philosophy, your approach to design, basically what you put in at Gateway 1. Why have you designed a building on this site for this purpose? What's the brief? What's the scope? What are you trying to achieve? How does that then meet functional requirements of building regs? Evidence that. Evidence it with drawings, details, technical specifications where you can, or performance spec where you can't, and any additional resources you've got. So make sure you put that in. Make sure you break down exactly how each floor is used. Make sure you're saying this is commercial units, this is residential, these are the kind of residents we've thought about coming in here. So that's the first part. So you've told me how you're going to meet your functional requirements of building regulations. The next part is, well, how is it going to be built? So we need to have things like a construction control plan. Link that back to your program. When are you going to need your building control on site to sign things off? When are you actually going to have a crane operator? How are you actually going to undertake the piling? What is going to be classified as temporary works? What's going to be classified as permanent works? How is that going to be programmed in? Show that within your construction control plan. How are you capturing your competency requirements of your sub-consultants that are coming on? the door installer, for example. Tell me how you're going to capture your competency. These are simple things that really need to be thought about before you go into a Gateway 2 application. The next part is how you're actually going to comply with your golden thread. The client, before Gateway 2, needs to have specified exactly how they need their golden thread, how they're going to use that golden thread in the occupation phase. If they don't have that, you're not going to pass Gateway 2. It's that simple. But once you've got that, what's the contractor going to do to ensure that they comply with that? So if it's a simple, I want an Excel spreadsheet of all my O&M data extracted out from the PDFs telling me who's done what, where it's installed, what day it started, when's the warranty start, when does the warranty end, give me the manufacturer and the model number. That could be as simple as they want it, absolutely fine. How is that contractor going to provide that? Who's going to provide it? When's it going to be provided? 6 weeks before? On the day of handover? Then also give me information around how you're going to pick up your commissioning, witnessing, and then the biggest one, which I think brings the biggest chats about how you're going to give me as-builts, how you're going to verify that they're correct. Now, I think that has probably been one of the biggest stumbling blocks when I've spoken to principal contractors over the last year and a half. They look at me saying, do we have to? Can we not just say as intended or as constructed? No, as built.
So we've had this debate on some of our projects where they're like, you have to provide contractually as built. And we said, well, we can't because we're not on site.
Yeah.
And then there's a debate about, well, we can provide you with marked up information of everything that's changed on site.
But it's not your responsibility. If you're not a principal designer under building regs, and even if you are, it's not your responsibility. The accountability and the handover requirement at Gateway 3 is that the principal contractor is responsible for providing as built.
But how is he or she going to provide that in reality if they've employed, I'm just saying, just being practical here, if you've got an architect, a design team, an M&E engineer, all the rest of it there, they're going to need generally those disciplines to produce the updated information.
So they might have red line drawings that go back to yourself. You've then updated them. Those updates then go back to them.
For them to check and do an inspection.
They can do a check. They can verify that they've checked it.
Well, that's what we're discussing. So there's a verification process. So we're not on site every day, but they're doing markups and saying this is, this has been built, which I guess theoretically it shouldn't really change because of the way. So, but there's always going to be possibly a minor change even under the new regulation.
And you've got to provide evidence that this is how it's been built. So that's why it falls back to the contractor. It could be something as simple as they've decided that at first fix, second fix, they're going to do a point cloud of the whole building. Therefore, it picks up a 360 image and model of exactly what's been built and what's been installed. That's one way for them to verify it. They could also be using things like Oculo, which is the funny-looking hat.
We use a lot of the VR stuff, but I think I do a lot of retrofit, which are really complicated, and often you don't know until quite late on in the project. So you will assume that they've done some tests. It looks like a concrete slab, but you cut out a bit and find out that it's just some timber that they're having to pour screed over the top of or something. And you're like, oh, okay, stop. You have to think, does that, God, it's going to just create. I haven't quite got to the stage where we're delivering these as HRBs or even under the new regs, but we're all still doing retrospective. But was a lot of things that can come up on old buildings that you cannot predict.
So one of our longest applications, 39 weeks, was an existing building. The reason it was complicated, we could not test the paint that was going to go onto the wall from 1944 in this block. So we ended up having to take a sample. And it was communal decoration, therefore it had fire implication. So we had to do testing and we had to prove it to the regulator before we could actually submit that and show it at Gateway 2.
So you're going to end up, because I can't remember how far you can go, because you're almost going to need to do an enabling works, quite heavy package to actually be able to submit. You're going to have to, because we do that anyway often, but are you going to... Can you do, how much work could you do under an HRB before?
Non-permanent and emergency works only.
So you could do a strip out contract and
some cut, but what we see certainly,
you might need to do propping and all sorts to actually test some of the things.
Potentially,
which then does it not become an HRB application?
Well, it only becomes a HRB application once you've had to do that. So, but remember, you could put it potentially under an emergency if it's an existing building. There's some structural failures that are happening that need to be addressed straight away. you may put propping in there to start off with. That would then be seen as emergency repairs because it won't be able to sustain a mitigated risk. Where you can, and this is, I think, where one of the things that we see a lot in existing buildings at the moment, where potentially they're looking at what can we get away with without having to go through the gateway application. Everything will go through existing risks. FRAs that have been around for 4 years that they've managed to, mitigate the risk for 4 years, they're now putting under emergency works, and it's like, well, that's wrong. Whereas, go through the gateway, but potentially, and I think it also comes back to new builds. I think one of the things that I've picked up on new builds, one of the biggest headaches that we've seen is around commercial fit outs. And how do you make sure that, where you think from a commercial perspective, and this is, you've got a HRB, it's gone through the gateways, it's past gateway 3, which is great, occupation, but you've got shell and core as a commercial fit out. Well, how are they not going to have to go through a gateway application?
But every single floor or tenant for a year's contract or 5 years contract or 2 years?
I'll bring it back to Newcastle. Greg's, the best baker in the world. They are everywhere. If Greg's are going to take out a commercial unit and a HRB, are they going to sit around for 12 months making sure they've done their application, waiting around at Gateway 2 before they can even build, make sure they've gone through a Gateway 3 application before they can even get in, before they can sell their first pastry? Of course not.
I thought there was an exemption for the commercial units.
It's not an exemption, it's just how you get around Cat A, Cat B fit outs.
Right.
It's the only way you can really get away from an exemption is if you can make sure that you've got a separate permanent structure within that.
So let's be clear, how would that work?
Separate compartmentation, separate structure, separate entrances, which you could do, but you'd have to design that in at Gateway 2. Now, where you think a Cat A works and Cat B works, as long as you're not penetrating through any of the fire stopping, compartmentation, changing any of the structure, potentially then you don't have to go through the gateways because you're not actually affecting any fire.
Because it's kind of like non-notifiable works, essentially. Yeah.
It's non-notifiable. So, there's going to have to be I imagine there's some commercial organisations that are going to have to think about how to set up their buildings to make sure that they don't have many applications. Do you know what I mean? So that they've got all the drainage in the right position. They've got it maybe bigger spans than they do otherwise. So you only have like non-load bearing. It will affect the kind of, I don't know, plug and play format that they might want to provide.
Completely, but it's the quickest way to get, where you look at a lot of these commercial fit outs, they want to be up and running as soon as possible. Realistically, where you're looking at a HRB,
God, it's going to be a lot of work. I wonder, kind of moving on to the wider picture of non-HRBs as well, is there any sort of tech solutions you think that might be out there to make it a bit easier? Because there's a huge kind of workload. Well, you're a tech background. What do you think?
Definitely. I mean, to be fair, where you look at the golden thread, it's all about being digital. Mm-hmm. Being digital means let's incorporate tech. Now, tech is probably better than the human eye at most things. Especially, I've always gone by the scenario and the statement of it takes a lot of hard work to look lazy, and I believe tech provides that. Mm-hmm. But where you think about validating applications, something simple, being able to say, have I got all 20 documents, all 30 documents at this case? Tech can tell us that. We don't need a human to go and tell us that. It would also save a lot of time from a validation perspective from a regulator if they had the assistance of automation through tech. But I think to get there, we need to be thinking about standardization. We need to be thinking about, a countrywide naming convention, how you name your documents that hand it in, even a structure. But for that, there needs to then be additional guidance around what do we actually need. And that's where it becomes difficult because every project won't require everything. There will be a core set of information that is required, but then potentially others. It's not to say it's impossible. Where you look at, if you're landlords and whatnot, where you're going through HMO licensing, selective licensing from whichever borough you're at, they have that portal available where you select these are the documents that I need to submit and it's validated for you automatically. So there's nothing stopping you from doing it.
So it sounds brilliant, but the cynic in me hate to name and shame them, but I think sometimes some planning departments deliberately don't validate things when they've got a huge backlog. And given the backlog that there is in the kind of Building Safety Act applications, possibly not in the interest of the regulator to validate quicker, because they still wouldn't be able to
So I'm going to defend the regulator.
application.
I am going to defend the regulator here. Yes, there is a backlog, and it's not to say that, you know, they are not going through all of them quick enough. That there are a lot of applications. There's not a lot of multidisciplinary teams and regulators available, but also there's a lot of crap.
Yeah.
If I'm honest with you, some of the applications that go through and some of the things that come back are absolutely disgraceful that are being sent.
I've seen a redacted rejection letter, which I think that you've seen the same one, so you know how many points there were, and there were a lot of points, and it did sound like it was a bad application. However, some of the rejection points I thought were verging on pedantic or completely over the top. Like, it didn't matter because there were 150 of them. So like one of them being silly was sort of irrelevant. But for me reading it, I was like, wow, actually, even on a good application, I think there was one about whether wind would build up between two towers, and you're like, well, that's maybe something that I wouldn't have thought of, you know, as a reason for rejection rather than an ask for more clarification.
Yeah. But in that redaction, you potentially might not have seen the request for information that would have gone out beforehand.
True.
And then if they weren't able to satisfy that request for information, or they didn't get back in time, which happens, then what can the regulator do without that?
Well, to take it back to your original, the very emotional statement that you made at the start, what I thought was interesting about that rejection letter was that I think maybe 5 or 10% were about fire.
Yeah.
And it's every part of the building regulation. So there was things about the membrane, there was things about the environmental performance, and you're like, well, okay, I thought that the Building Safety Act was largely about building safety, therefore it would focus on fire safety and other life safety aspects, but it wasn't. It was like pretty much every discipline in the multidisciplinary team piling on to what was clearly a bad application, but then putting just everything they could think of. And I'm not sure that like there's quite a lot of anger in the industry at the way that they feel, that the industry feels the regulator is approaching the industry by saying, the statements in the public realm by I think it's the vice chair saying, well, I haven't seen a good application yet. I think that infuriated people, because it's like, well, tell us what good is, show us good, and then we'll aim for it.
I think there definitely needs to be more communication. I think there needs to be more communication both ways, if I'm honest with you, more constructive dialogue rather than, and I agree, there is widespread industry outrage about how it's been done. What I would say to some of the industry is, I understand, but at the same time, can you actually say that you have read all of the Building Safety Act, and on top of that, how have you actually applied it so far, and what are you doing? Now, there will be a good percentage that are saying, look, we're doing X, Y, and Z, so yes, we're following that. But you also know, and we work with people, and you're working on projects, I'm sure, where that doesn't happen, where there is still a lot of design teams and whatnot that have probably never even picked it up. If we look at our building regulations tracker on projects that we show, you guys have seen our building regulations tracker. I can guarantee you, in nearly every single one of my projects, the design team will say, I didn't even know I was in charge of looking at that building regulation. So that's not to say they're not competent, but it's almost like they're trying to refresh your memory. This is what you're actually meant to be doing. We're so ingrained in what we've done all the time that we don't really change, but we've got a broken system that potentially needs to be fixed. It's not perfect by all means, and it will change.
Can you see that? I think we had Gary Plusty from Greystar on last week, and he said, there's a simple way around this. I'm just not going to put in any buildings that are over 6. I'm not going to propose buildings that are over 6 stories. And that's Greystar. They're pretty big. And how do you think the industry does this system settle down? Is it fit enough for purpose that it can be bedded in, or does it need a bit of a rethink? What's your view?
Look, the Safety Act is still new. It is going to take time for teething issues to come. There will be changes to the Act, I'm sure. Like any Act, there's always updates. If we look at the Building Act, it still gets updated, does it not? There's going to be updates. if you remember, part 1 states that they're going to change definitions of HRBs. There will be more updates. It's interesting that Greystar are saying, we won't build anything over 6 stories. It's probably the wrong attitude to have, because yes, from a commercial perspective, it might take you longer and whatnot, but what happens when the HRB requirements go lower?
Do you think that's definitely going to happen?
Oh, it will happen in time.
So that's interesting.
Happen.
So I mean, what you're so I kind of there's these two worlds that coexist at the moment. There's kind of sitting on the RBA course that I'm just completing at the moment. There's having conversations yourself on what we're trying to do, which is lean into that and train our team and kind of step into that, thing. And then there's like a lot of other people who are just furious. And some people say, well, I'm not doing it till I'm kind of forced to, or if I have to.
Yeah.
It's like, I'll wait till everyone, I don't want to be the early adopter.
But if it comes down to 11 metres, then everyone will end up doing it.
But yeah. I would say
what's
I'd
the
rather
future?
be.
Can I just ask you, what do you think? I'm not going to hold you to it, but
No.
can you put your crystal ball out? What over the next 5 to 10 years, what happens?
I can see more buildings coming into the HRB definition. So potentially hotels, commercial spaces. I do think that it'll lower in height. 11 metres. I don't think it'll be all buildings, but I do think it'll be 11 metres. That would then align with the Fire Safety Act, which would make sense. And that would also mean 790,000 buildings roughly that would fall under from an existing perspective. So I don't think it'll happen straight away. I also think that there will be a few changes around the regulatory approach, how the regulator approaches it. Also, where you think about the findings of Grenfell that were accepted by the government, there's an overarching regulator that's going to come into play.
Yeah.
There is also the fact that we're going to embrace the golden thread more. There's a lot that's coming. The Safety Act's just one part. I think, for anything to work successfully, it takes 10 years at least to adopt, especially in this country. It's not just something that we can do overnight. We've been... I've been in the industry since I was 20 odd, about 15 years now. So even I have things in which I do all the time that even I'm like, actually, we shouldn't do it that way. This is the right approach. It takes time. I do think there needs to be more dialogue. I think there needs to be industry groups that are potentially listened to a little bit more. We always go to, and rightly, we go to the likes of REBA and SEAT and SIBSI, and they should have their members speaking, and I'm sure they have their forums for their members to speak. But what's stopping the HSC from getting in touch with all building regs PDs that have submitted gateway applications and saying, how did you find that process? What's been going
Feedback
on?
loop, yeah.
These are the sort of things that need to maybe go in, and from there they can make better informed decisions on their processes and what's going on. That's something I've not seen.
Yeah, because I think that I would love to sort of kind of wrap it up on a kind of positive note. And I think a lot of developers and architects and professionals generally feel quite overwhelmed by the new regulation. And I'm wondering, can you give them some good news on how it could work and what the changes are going to happen and how you see it?
Well, a successful gateway to application means you have a building that is pretty much ready to be built. So when you think of it in that way, yes, you've put in the hard work early on, but it's the work you were going to put in anyway. You've also got a safer building. You've also got better value engineered buildings, better coordinated buildings. You also have a greater understanding of the cost implications of said building. Your quantities and everything else can be calculated early on. So you actually are aware of everything within your building before you're actually going to start building it, which is critical. What I would also say is where it comes to gateway to applications, I think we overcomplicate them ourselves. I think because of the worry that we have, we actually overcomplicate it. Now, the projects we work on together, you've seen, yes, there's more work, but I think Ollie, you said it best. It's actually just a big coordination process.
Yeah.
And I think if you approach it in that way, it doesn't have to be daunting. I think because it's new, because nobody knows what it is, I think that terrifies everybody a bit more.
I think it's actually, you are right, it has the potential to make it less stressful on site. Like the last thing, our worst nightmare is that phone call which you get from a client where they're like, I can't get through to anybody else and I'm ringing you because like whatever, pile's in the wrong place. And you would think that actually this is going to mitigate those type of things that do happen on site, where things aren't properly coordinated, and it happens.
Definitely, and when they want to often on site, we're just going to change a few products because it's and it's like, wait a minute, guys, this is like huge, and we can't even think. In the half an hour you want us to make a decision on it. It's like 1,000 different implications, and that really helps the architect, I think, because it's like that's one of the worst things. It's like, we just want to change from A to B. It's like, whoa, and they're like, why are you making it so difficult? It's like, I
think the challenge for us is actually extracting the fees required to do that, because it is more work, and actually like particularly like the narrative stuff is not. I mean, went into architecture, I didn't have to write things, and now there I am having to work on a very long Word document.
That's what ChatGPT's for. I'm just joking. I'm just joking. That's what but you're right. But then at the same time, where it comes to your narrative, 50% of it's already been done in your Gateway 1 application, because you've already spoken about your design philosophy. Now all you're doing is you're talking about, well, how have you actually taken that step further to meet functional requirements of building regulations?
But I do think, going back to, we've been talking a lot about the role of the architect.
Yeah.
And here I think it is the chance for us to narrate or curate, direct, whatever word you want to use, the process, and sort of set out the philosophy from the beginning and how that goes through. And that could be drawings, not big prose. And I think
there's quite a lot of it that's like writing, because you've got to evidence stuff, and it feels a little bit like those things that you used to have to do in English lessons, where it's like, explain this thing, it's like, it's quite.
But you see, I always remember. So when I got into architecture, I remember the quote, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us."
Mm-hmm.
That was Winston Churchill saying that. Where you look at what you're doing right now, you're actually shaping everything around your design, your philosophy, and everything else. You're shaping them buildings for everybody to go and live in them. You're actually bringing back the architecture into the architect. That's how I look at it.
What a good way to finish. Varun, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.